I'm going to talk a bit about my career working in the kind of intersection of design and innovation. And there's been a lot of great conversations about design. I'm going to talk about maybe the role of design in kind of complex systems, which has been my experience working in different areas. So I really like this idea the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones. I think the idea that, kind of the nature of how, our human evolution is really linked to the idea of the objects that we build and how much we kind of adapt our environments and how much kind of planning and building and crafting is part of our kind of inherent evolution. And I think from a design story, it's the idea that we shape our tools and then they shape us. And so we all know this. And I think there's a little bit of anthropology probably in every designer in terms of understanding, how much we craft and how much we plan and craft and engineer objects. And then inherently we start to use them. And then often our behaviors are really adapted by the tools that we choose to adopt at scale in particular. And so, I think everyone's seen images like the one on the right where lots of tops of people's heads as we all kind of glance downwards. And so much of kind of emerging tools are really, really shaping our behavior at scale, which is really interesting. I think, again, from a design perspective, where there's two things that you're always aware of as a designer. So technology shapes our environment. And an awful lot of, lovely conversation this morning was about shaping environments. But also cultures shape behavior. So I think this becomes a bigger conversation about kind of free will and stuff and the degree to which people act out of habits, and habits are so shaped by either our culture or by the environment we're in. And so, the role of design is really thinking about how we shape a lot of behaviors, either through environments or tools or culture. So designers were keepers of a material culture. I think, if you walk into a museum, a lot of designers are pretty fascinated. I went to the Royal College of Art in London and it was right beside the Victoria and Albert Museum. I just loved going down and just this kind of curated history of all the artifacts that humans have kind of created, and the kind of inherent language and kind of symbolism that gets built into objects, and how much in the absence of that culture you can kind of interpret and understand, kind of shared hopes and fears that are often really embodied in objects, and the kind of, again, the kind of iconic meaning of objects and how they persist and tell stories. So, but what's happening is our material culture is no longer material, right? So I think this is a really interesting thing happening from a design perspective, is that I certainly trained in industrial design and actually originally in clothing design, and it was very tangible design. And I think design is becoming more and more abstracted. There's this expression, design change is often more evident in the absence of things than in the presence. And so sometimes we look at design and we study what people are doing, and we try and understand need through, how people behave. But often it's what's most important is these kind of pivots where people stop doing something. It's actually often more indicative of change and more significant, I guess. This really, really quickly, this has been my design career. So, we went from an agrarian economy to a manufacturing economy, which, potentially they were like, really elongated periods of time. And then I've worked in design for about 30 years. And so in the last 20, I've worked through a manufacturing economy. That's where I started as a designer. And then a service economy. I worked in what was called an experience economy. There has been reference to an attention economy, sharing economy, which I think didn't really take off. Then a data economy, and a reputation and trust economy. And I think, these are all potentially kind of buzzwords, but this is how, how fast our economies are starting to kind of evolve and morph and change, and how rapidly they're being reinterpreted. And design kind of tracks along with that. So, I think a lot of people think design is about, designing things people want. I think my experience more and more is design that makes people want things. There's this kind of shift between, and I think it's a bit of a kind of, maybe it's a bit of a contradiction or a bit of a tension within design, is that you want to design things that people want, but ultimately you're often designing things that are quite addictive. So my career started and has been kind of maybe reflective of the kind of degrees of complexity in design. So I started off designing underwear for pennies, straight out of college at the National College of Art and Design in Dublin. I did fashion design, and then quickly moved into, after my graduate work, I worked in kind of mobile tech and worked for the Department of Defense. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. And then I went into working into healthcare. And so, degrees of complexity, but also degrees of abstraction, like thinking about how complex the systems that I was working within, but also thinking how abstracted that design was and how systemic it is. And I think that's really interesting. So really quickly, this is such a huge story, so I'm going to just touch on one tiny part of it. It was a really interesting part of my career, getting to work for the Department of Defense on a couple of different programs. We did a lot of robotics and material tech, but also this kind of wearable. That was my area of expertise for about 10 years. And so I learned a really interesting thing about innovation. So we used to go to what were called developer meetings. I guess there were huge sessions where the Department of Defense brought all the different developer communities, mostly engineering firms, together. And they were typically had a keynote similar to, you know, lots of kind of conferences, I guess, have keynotes, and they would bring some really kind of decorated colonel from the Department of Defense, and they would talk about the future of kind of defense, and they would talk about the future of warfare and defense. And they would always have, this is in the era of power, you know, kind of clip art. It's in the 90s. And there was this, what we called the burning baby slide. There was this clip art where they would have a series of little icons, and they would basically be talking about context, like it would, you know, warfare was becoming more urban. There was going to be, you know, a certain kind of, you know, kind of large weaponry. There would be bad guys and good guys, and then there would be basically this kind of the kind of collateral damage, the innocent bystander. And they would do a lot of arrows, and then they would put flames coming out of the baby's head. I'm not joking. So, and it was a way of describing a kind of scenario. And it was an awful lot about, you know, when you're working in the kind of defense industry, you're often speculating about, you know, what the future of war would be like. And it was going to be moving into being more urban, and it was probably being more kind of terrorist based. And they were aware of that. And yet there was this kind of abstraction in terms of being able to tell that story. And I remember distinctly, we would always kind of wait for what we call the burning baby slide, which I know sounds kind of dark, but it was just in terms of understanding how people were speculating, you know, on something that was very abstract. And then really quickly, this happened September 11th. And so what happened was there was no longer a need to make those kind of slides. There was no clip art. There was really vivid imagery of something that had been talked about in the abstract as almost fiction for so long. And what it was really interesting for me, I was no longer working in the defense industry, but what it taught me about innovation is that it's not always about things getting better. And I know that's, you know, probably not a great thing to, or not a optimistic story, but I think it's really important to understand the origins of an awful lot of innovation. Often comes out of urgency and comes out of crisis. And certainly we're at a kind of point right now with a global pandemic that people don't know how to feel about change, they don't know how to feel about innovation, but historically we've seen, you know, amazing pivots and creativity coming out of crisis. So I went to work for the Mayo Clinic. I worked in between the Department of Defense. I also was at the Media Lab and did some other stuff, but I'm going to tell a quick story about, or a couple of insights about innovation from working in the healthcare, you know, the system of kind of healthcare, delivering healthcare. And, you know, I can go without saying that working at Mayo Clinic was pretty remarkable. As a designer, it was a wonderful experience. I tried really hard to get to work in healthcare for a long time. And finally was, you know, really grateful for this opportunity. Mayo's, you know, it's a destination medical practice for what they call kind of esoteric medical conditions, and it is pretty remarkable. People that work there, and they have a single code, which is really the needs of the patient come first. So what I noticed when you get there, and there's been a lot of lovely kind of reference to built environments this morning, and so when I got there, I kind of started to look at did a little bit of a kind of anatomy, or maybe a little bit of analysis of innovation at Mayo Clinic, and I realized that not an awful lot has changed. So this was a photograph that I pulled from some documents in the consulting rooms, 1954, and then when I was there, a similar consulting room, and really the only difference is that the windows went away, and I think they may have gone to the consultants. And then we also got a computer. And what this tells you, and I think anyone who understands design and the built environment understands that this is a very ritualized environment. And so what's happening here is that there's that kind of environment is triggering a set of behaviors, and these behaviors are being preserved and ritualized. And the fact that, in 70 years, something doesn't change is really indicative of maybe a kind of resistance to change. And so, my role was to work in the Center for Innovation. And so indications like this are very significant. This was lovely. I was given this slide actually by someone who, just to explain the evolution of the practice, the medical practice at Mayo. And it just talks about the fragmentation and how, the medicine has become specialized into so many different divisions, so many different subspecialties. If you take one, like internal medicine, it's got subdivisions and subdivisions. And so you think about this fractal effect, this fracturing of a system that is so complex. And this is also before we started to think about the role of technology and telemedicine. So you would probably add an additional layer of complexity and abstraction to this slide. What this teaches you really is that the classical response to an increase in scale in any operation, not just in healthcare, typically relies on standardization. So you really start to understand complex systems at scale. Their focus is really about trying to stabilize them. In healthcare, the system's optimized, then it's trying to mitigate risk, not create value. And this was pretty radical, I think, for a lot of people at Mayo to understand when we used to play this insight back to them about the fact that each individual is aware of their attempting to deliver really good care and compassion and create value. But the organization at scale is actually more focused on mitigating risk because of its size and because of the risk and complexity in it. This was a famous quote talking about Kodak, at the moment where it basically I think when it became relatively obsolete. So then Bob Sutton, who ran Kodak, said, in other words, we kept getting better and better at doing the wrong thing. And this happens a lot of organizations when they start to become really standardized. And I think it is really an interesting thing about scale and growth and success is that sometimes you become so large that you focus too much on doing the wrong thing. This expression was used. I presented at a conference in Australia, and they said we have a saying here for that. They said they call it "nice landing, wrong airport." And I think this is a really important insight for innovation: is that if you're thinking too tactically and not strategically, you can be really, really good in terms of the operation of what you're doing, but the degree to which you're aware in terms of how much that is actually going to deliver the real value. And this is back to healthcare, to mitigating risk and not creating value. This is another insight from Mayo that. I think this is really important for designers more than anyone, and I call it the innovation dilemma. And I think it's easier to describe a problem than it is to fix it. And so we spent an awful lot of time making, and I've used the expression innovation porn, which I hope is okay to say, where you get really, you can really get kind of intoxicated by creating all these beautiful artifacts to describe how well you understand complexity in the problem, and even how the value of visualizing it doesn't necessarily mean you've actually fixed the problem. And sometimes these artifacts become kind of social currency in creating them. But I think the most important thing is to focus innovation on actually really fixing the problem. And a colleague of mine had said, beware the true but useless. And I think that's a really important reminder in innovation, is don't to get distracted just in your diagnostics. This was really interesting watching people in complex systems using tools. So, we did the EMR, which is electronic medical record, and we looked at, kind of how people work inside a really complex system such as Mayo and the role of tools. And we discovered that people collaborate in spite of tools are given, not because of them. And this is the nurses, and they had this expression, hunting and gathering, where they would go looking for information. Now, this is a massive story. I won't get into it now. I can't get into it now, but I think just the kind of, again, it's back to the original couple of slides about kind of people and tools and how they shape our behavior, but they also can shape pretty deviant behavior if the tools are really bad. People have a really strong coping mechanism, so you actually won't realize how dysfunctional your system is because people cope so effectively. This is probably another way of putting it, is people ignore design that ignores people, right? So if you give them really bad systems and really bad tools, you may not know, you'll just discover that they've been those amazing workarounds and coping mechanisms that have emerged culturally. This is a nice insight. I think this is important again. So what often looks like innovation in complex systems, such as healthcare, is really just redistribution of complexity to a different part of the system. And this was something I became aware of when we started to work a lot in the area of chronic disease, because we were aware of a lot of the kind of burden was being shifted to patients and patients' families, and the idea of kind of care in the home and telemedicine originally. And so, I think just that principle that is often what it looks like, innovation and change is just that you're taking complexity and you're moving a different part of the system. And that is not innovation. Innovation that's additive is more tolerated than innovation that's subtractive or destructive. We did a really interesting piece of work around looking at a stool collection kit for colorectal cancer screening, and it was essentially going to cannibalize a part of the kind of clinical business that we had in colonoscopy. And so it was really interesting. We're making an awful lot of money at Mayo in this kind of, in the diagnostics that was basically destination. It was about kind of patients coming in for this procedure that involved anesthetic, and it was very expensive and quite distressing for them. And we had developed a home test kit, which was very inexpensive. But what was interesting was watching the same organization develop one, understanding it was going to cannibalize a part of their business, and did it very successfully. But the insight certainly here is that some people aren't terribly intimidated by innovation when you add it, but innovation starts to challenge, any of the kind of status quo, and innovation that is destructive or abstractive, where it actually starts to take things away, you will find huge cultural resistance to that. And I'll touch really quickly at how am I doing on time?
Hi, Lorna, Nicola here. If you have about 2 minutes.
Okay, I'm going to run through these. So,
Great.
I've worked a lot in emerging tech recently, and again, there's just lots of really interesting stuff happening that is relevant to healthcare. I'll just talk 3 or 4 slides through what I think is most significant. So, I think for generations we've taught humans how to understand tech, right? So I think an awful lot of we've had, we've developed technology that is relatively obscure and kind of complex, and we've always spent time trying to understand it. And I think with AI and machine learning, moving forward, we're going to teach technology how to understand us. And I think this is such a significant pivot. We have people making tools to do the jobs they used to do. And so I think there's a really interesting conversation around workforce and automation, and what's happening in kind of workforce, and in terms of thinking about equity between humans and technology. And I think just kind of how equity or how access is distributed equally. So really interesting things happening in terms of how technology is becoming, competing for some of the kind of activities that have traditionally been considered very human. I work, again, as I mentioned, working a lot in the tech industry. It's a really interesting culture to work inside of, and I think it is, a culture that is incredibly experimental, and I think quite comfortable with ambiguity. They have this term, move fast and break things, or ask for forgiveness, not permission, both of which come from the original kind of Cold War. In terms of the culture of tech, came out of the Cold War, and again, back to urgency and back to this imperative around speed. This is a fantastic slide and a quote: "We can train you how to do what's needed, but we can't tell you what you're doing." And these were women who, I can't remember exactly, I have a note somewhere, but they were basically part of a cold fusion nuclear development of the H-bomb, and they basically worked in this part of this facility, but they knew what the job they were told to do. They didn't understand what they were actually doing. And I think that a lot of what's happening with technology right now is becoming quite opaque and obscure, and an awful lot of the kind of what humans are doing in the system is becoming less and less fully understood. We're morphing so fast, our ability to invent new things far outpaces the rate we can civilize them. Kevin Kelly, who started Wired magazine, this is really interesting about people's kind of tech anxiety and how much we understand the tools that we have at scale. And back to my original first or second slide, how much it's shaping our behavior. Toxic innovation is a term I really like, because I think also people think that innovation is always inherently good and you're some kind of Luddite if you don't embrace technology without any question. I think there's an awful lot of good, healthy conversations about toxic innovation. Design for addiction and design for planned obsolescence will be one reason to think about that. There's been a really interesting shift. I mean, I worked in the area of human-centered design, and it was all about optimizing, systems and optimizing products and services for people and being kind of very humane. And there's been quite an interesting shift to planet-centered design. I think that is actually much more important to not just think about people, because people at scale we can actually be quite destructive, as we all are aware. And to really shift towards a planet-centered design. I think some of the conversations this morning spoke to that really well. Thank you.